The sun had just begun to dip behind the jagged mesas, painting the New Mexico sky in strokes of burnt orange and crimson. The land stretched endlessly, dry and unforgiving, whispering only to the wind and the tumbleweeds that drifted across its face. It was a place where only the tough survived, and where the broken came to hide. Along a narrow trail cutting through the sandstone cliffs, a lone figure moved like a shadow against the fading light. She was wrapped in a tattered brown shawl, her steps uneven, her body frail from hunger and grief. Her name was Nayeli, a young Apache widow whose heart had been carved hollow by war and loss. 2 winters ago, the U.S. cavalry raided her village. Her husband, a proud Apache warrior named Koda, had fallen in the fight to protect their people. Their home was burned, their horses stolen, and their son, only 6 years old, vanished amid the smoke. Nayeli never saw him again. Since that night, she had wandered between abandoned camps and ghost towns, surviving on roots and rainwater. Each morning she awoke to the sound of wind through the canyon and prayed her boy might still be alive somewhere. Each night she whispered her husband's name to the stars, promising she would find him. But now her body was failing. Her moccasins were worn through, her lips cracked from thirst, and as the cold desert wind rose, she came upon the one thing that could change her fate: a horse. It stood tethered outside a small sheriff's station at the edge of the dusty town of Redwood Bluff. The creature was strong and sleek, its black coat shining even in the dim light. A saddle rested on its back, and beside it hung the golden star of a man she had heard about in whispers. Sheriff Colton Hayes. He was known across 3 counties. A man of iron will, once a gunslinger turned lawman. Some said he had killed more outlaws than smallpox. Others claimed he carried a guilt deeper than the desert graves he dug. Nayeli crouched in the shadows, her heart pounding. She knew what stealing a horse meant in this land: death by hanging. But hunger and despair speak louder than fear. With trembling hands, she loosened the rope and whispered an old Apache blessing to the creature. The horse stirred, sensing her desperation. For a brief moment, their eyes met, woman and beast, both worn by the world. Then she mounted and nudged the reins. The sound of hooves broke the night silence. Inside the sheriff's office, a lantern flickered. Sheriff Hayes looked up from his desk. He saw his horse disappear down the trail and reached for his hat. Instead of firing his rifle, he stepped into the night, calm as the desert before a storm. He followed her tracks along the arroyo, through the sagebrush and sand. The stars watched as man and horse thief crossed the desert, one chasing, one fleeing. By dawn, the widow's strength was gone, her vision blurred, her body weak from hunger. She pulled the horse to a stop near an abandoned well and slid to the ground. Her breath came shallow. Her hands trembled as she reached for the canteen at her side, empty. Moments later, the sound of hooves echoed through the canyon. The sheriff appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He dismounted slowly, his eyes on the faint figure slumped beside his horse. He could have drawn his gun. He could have dragged her back to town in chains as the law demanded. But instead, he saw her hands, calloused, trembling, empty. He saw the thinness of her frame, the scars across her arms, the worn shawl that told a story of suffering no thief could fake. The sheriff kneeled beside her and poured water from his flask to her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, afraid, but he didn't speak. He simply covered her with his coat, staring at the horizon where the first rays of sunlight touched the red cliffs. As the warmth returned to her face, Nayeli drifted into uneasy sleep. In her dreams, she saw her husband again, standing on a ridge, calling her name. But this time, he wasn't alone. A small boy stood beside him, waving. She reached out, but they vanished into the wind. When she awoke, she found herself by a small campfire. The sheriff sat nearby, brewing coffee over the flames. His revolver lay beside him, but untouched. He had not bound her hands. He had not taken his horse away. He looked at her with the quiet patience of a man who had seen too much death to crave more. And though she didn't understand why, Nayeli felt a strange calm. Perhaps the desert had finally decided she had suffered enough. As the sun climbed higher, the sheriff motioned toward the distant hills. Somewhere beyond them, smoke rose from another camp, a trail of life in a dying land. He pointed, then stood, and began to pack his things. Nayeli understood. He wasn't turning her in. He was leading her somewhere. She watched him mount his horse, the same one she had tried to steal, and then gesture for her to follow on foot. For the first time in years she obeyed without fear. The road stretched out before them, long, silent, endless. The sheriff led the way and the widow walked behind, her shadow crossing his in the dust. Neither spoke, yet something unspoken passed between them, a fragile thread of trust woven through sorrow. By the time the sun began to set again, the canyon walls had turned gold. They stopped at a small stream where water shimmered like glass. Nayeli knelt to drink, her reflection rippling in the current. She felt the sheriff's eyes on her, not of judgment, but of understanding. And in that quiet place, beneath the whispering wind and the songs of unseen crickets, a story began. Not of vengeance, but of mercy, because sometimes in the cruelest lands, kindness is the rarest miracle of all. As night descended again, the sheriff looked toward the horizon, his jaw set, as if something heavy still haunted him, and Nayeli, wrapped once more in her tattered shawl, wondered who this man was, this lawman who showed mercy to a thief. The desert was far from done with them, for in the shadows of the next dawn, something awaited, something that would test both their hearts in ways neither could yet imagine. The morning sun rose over the wide mesas of Redwood Bluff, cutting through the mist that hung low across the sagebrush. Dust glimmered like gold beneath its light, and the desert came alive again with the hum of life and silence woven together, the way only the Wild West could breathe. Nayeli followed behind the sheriff's horse, her bare feet sinking into the sand. Her body ached, but something deeper than fatigue urged her forward, something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, not yet, but a faint pull toward life. Sheriff Colton Hayes rode ahead, steady and silent. The brim of his hat cast a long shadow across his face, hiding the scars of time and regret. Every movement he made was deliberate, not the hurried stride of a man chasing duty, but the careful pace of someone who had learned patience through pain. He had once been known across the frontier as the Iron Sheriff, a man who kept order in lawless lands. But the years had changed him. There were too many graves behind him, too many names carved into wood and stone because of the gun he carried. The law was his shield, but it had also been his curse. The Apache widow, the same woman who had tried to steal his horse, now walked beside him, weak but determined. He could see it in her posture. She was someone who had lost everything yet refused to die. That kind of spirit was rare out here, rarer than water in the desert. By noon they reached a small stream cutting through the canyon. The sheriff stopped to water his horse and refill his canteen. Nayeli knelt beside the stream, scooping handfuls of cool water to her lips. Her reflection trembled in the current, a face marked by hunger, grief, and sun. As she drank, her gaze drifted toward the sheriff's gun belt lying near a rock for a heartbeat. The old instinct to flee flashed through her mind. She could take his horse again, vanish into the mesas, never be seen. But when she looked up and saw the man's quiet composure, the way he trusted her enough to turn his back, the thought dissolved. This man was not like the soldiers who had destroyed her village. His silence carried no cruelty, only weariness. After a while they continued eastward. The sheriff's destination remained unknown to her. The path grew narrower, winding between red cliffs and dry riverbeds. Overhead, vultures circled lazily in the sky, waiting for the desert to claim another soul. Every now and then, he would glance back to see if she was keeping up. If she lagged too far behind, he slowed the horse. When they crossed rocky ground, he dismounted and walked beside her. Not once did he speak. His actions alone carried meaning. As the afternoon wore on, they came upon the charred remains of an old stagecoach. The wheels were broken, the paint faded to ash. Bones of horses lay scattered nearby, bleached by sun and time. Nayeli paused, staring at the destruction. She knew this kind of sight too well. The sheriff surveyed the wreck quietly. His eyes hardened for a moment, not out of fear but recognition. He had seen what raids could do, both from settlers and natives alike. Violence did not discriminate in these lands. He knelt beside the wreckage and picked up a small wooden trinket half buried in the dust. A child's toy horse, whittled crudely by hand. Something in his face shifted then, a memory stirring like dust after a storm. He slipped the toy into his coat and stood. They moved on. By the time dusk began to settle, the canyon walls glowed red as blood. They reached a narrow valley where mesquite trees grew sparse and shadows grew long. There, the sheriff stopped and began setting up camp. Nayeli watched, uncertain, until he handed her a small piece of dried meat and a canteen of water. It had been years since anyone had shared a meal with her. She ate slowly, her eyes fixed on the fire. The smoke carried the scent of wood and memory. That night, as the stars began to bloom above them, she lay awake listening to the distant howl of coyotes. Her thoughts wandered, to her husband, to her son, to the night of fire that had torn her life apart. The sheriff sat nearby, sharpening his knife under the moonlight. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone echoed through the canyon. He didn't look at her, yet somehow she knew he understood that silence was safer than words, because words could reopen wounds that time hadn't managed to close. When dawn returned, they resumed their journey. The sheriff's pace was steady, almost ritualistic, like a man following ghosts. For the first time, Nayeli wondered where he was leading her. She had expected him to turn her in to the nearest town. Instead, he was leading her farther into the wilderness. By midday, they arrived at a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Below lay an abandoned mission. Its roof half collapsed, its bell tower leaning, but smoke curled faintly from a small chimney. Someone still lived there. The sheriff dismounted and looked toward the crumbling structure. There was a heaviness in his posture now, as if he had reached the edge of something long avoided. Nayeli stood beside him, unsure. Her instincts whispered caution. The place felt haunted, not by spirits but by memories too strong to die. The sheriff walked ahead, leading his horse down the slope. Nayeli followed, the sound of their steps mingling with the cry of distant ravens. When they reached the old mission, the door creaked open on its own. Dust drifted in the sunlight streaming through the cracks. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and sorrow. On a table near the altar lay a faded photograph, a woman with gentle eyes holding a small child. The sheriff's hand trembled as he picked it up. He stared at it for a long while, his jaw tightening. Nayeli saw something change in him then, the strength of a lawman cracking under the weight of his past. This place had once been home to him, or at least to the people he had loved. He placed the photograph back and turned away. His silence deepened, like a man reliving sins too old to confess. Nayeli began to understand. The sheriff was not leading her to judgment. He was leading her to redemption, perhaps for both of them. As evening fell, he stepped outside and looked toward the horizon where storm clouds gathered. The wind carried the scent of rain, rare and sacred in the desert. Far in the distance, a faint flicker of firelight appeared, not from their camp, but from another ridge. Smoke rose into the twilight sky, dark and deliberate. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Trouble was coming, and Nayeli, for the first time since her husband's death, felt a chill of fear that was not for herself, but for the man who had shown her mercy. The storm, both of nature and fate, was drawing near. The storm rolled in from the western hills, like an army of ghosts. By the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the sky had turned the color of iron, and thunder rumbled across the open land. The air grew heavy, smelling of dust and coming rain. Sheriff Colton Hayes stood outside the old mission, his hat pulled low, watching the dark horizon. He had spent years chasing storms like this, storms of men, not weather, and every time they came, they left something broken behind. Beside him, Nayeli gathered what little firewood she could find. Her movements were slow but careful, her face illuminated by flashes of lightning. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones and wakes memories better left buried. Inside the mission, the sheriff's horse pawed the ground nervously. Animals always knew when danger was near. Then, far across the canyon, another flash of light revealed 3 riders cresting the ridge, shadows against the storm. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. They were coming fast. He knew that gait, that deliberate predatory movement. These weren't travelers, they were bounty men. Outlaws who hunted for coin, not justice. And out here, men like that would kill for less than a horse. He turned toward Nayeli, his mind already racing. He had seen enough death to know what was about to happen if he didn't act. She was a fugitive to the law, maybe even worth something to the wrong men. He could see the question in her eyes, the faint flicker of fear she tried to hide behind calm resolve, but the sheriff had made his choice the moment he gave her water. He wouldn't hand her over, not to men like them. The first drops of rain began to fall, hitting the cracked earth like small stones. Then the wind rose, whistling through the canyon with a mournful cry. The sheriff led Nayeli and the horse into the mission's cellar, a small space beneath the floorboards once used to store grain. The wood smelled of rot and dust, but it would hide them for a while. As the storm raged above, the sound of hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. The riders arrived at the mission, their voices faint beneath the roar of the wind. Boots struck the porch. A gun belt clinked. Nayeli sat in the darkness, her heart pounding. She could hear the sheriff above, his footsteps moving slowly, deliberately. He wasn't running, he was waiting. Then came the sound, the thud of the mission door bursting open, followed by a sudden crash as wood splintered against stone. Lightning illuminated the room through the cracks in the wall. Shadows moved like ghosts through the light. For a few long moments the world was nothing but thunder and fear. Nayeli closed her eyes and prayed to the old spirits of her people, to her husband, to her ancestors. The prayers were silent, but they filled the air. Above her, gunfire cracked through the storm, short, sharp, deliberate. The smell of smoke filled the air. The sheriff fought like a man who had long made peace with death, calm, precise, merciless when forced. Then silence. Only the rain continued, falling in sheets against the roof. Nayeli waited, every heartbeat echoing like a drum. When she finally emerged from the cellar, the storm was beginning to fade. The air shimmered with the aftermath of battle, the faint tang of gunpowder, the smell of wet earth, the bodies of the fallen lying in the mud. 3 men lay still near the mission steps. The sheriff stood among them, his hat drenched, his face unreadable. He looked not like a victor, but like a man haunted by the price of survival. Nayeli approached quietly, her bare feet sinking into the mud. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. The sheriff's gaze met hers for a brief moment, not of pride or triumph, but of weariness. He holstered his gun and turned away. The rain washed the blood from his hands. For the rest of the night neither spoke. They stayed inside the mission, the fire burning low. The sheriff cleaned his weapon in silence, while Nayeli mended a torn blanket. Outside, the storm passed, leaving only the steady dripping of water from the roof. When dawn came, the desert was quiet again, too quiet. The air smelled of wet dust and smoke. Ravens circled overhead, drawn by what the storm had left behind. The sheriff saddled his horse, ready to move. Nayeli watched him, sensing his unease. He knew that killing those men wouldn't end things. Out here, every death drew another. He gathered the weapons from the fallen and buried them in the sand near the old bell tower. When he was done, he stood for a long time staring at the graves, as though speaking to ghosts only he could hear. Nayeli stood beside him, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of something he hadn't felt in years, understanding. She didn't look at him with fear, nor gratitude, but with the quiet recognition of another soul who had seen too much loss. They rode out before the sun reached its peak, heading south toward the edge of the mountains. The land began to change, the red cliffs giving way to rolling grasslands and scattered mesquite. Along the way, they passed the remnants of a small Apache camp. The ashes were cold, the shelters burned, scattered beads and broken arrows lay half buried in the sand. Nayeli dismounted and knelt among them, touching the earth softly. There, beneath the ashes, she found a child's toy, a small carved figure made of bone. Her breath caught. It was the same kind her husband had carved for their son. For a moment, hope flickered again. Could her boy still be alive? The sheriff watched her quietly. He didn't speak, but he understood the weight of what she had found. He picked up a small scrap of cloth beside the ashes, a piece of military fabric. Soldiers had been here. Recently, it meant one thing. There was still war in the valleys below. As they rode on, the land opened into a wide plain where the wind carried the scent of smoke from distant fires. In the distance, faint trails of riders moved across the horizon. The sheriff's instincts stirred. They were being followed again. He didn't tell Nayeli, not yet, but every few miles he looked back over his shoulder, watching the dust trails behind them grow thicker. By evening, they reached a cluster of abandoned mining shacks near a dry riverbed. It wasn't much, but it would offer shelter. The sheriff built a small fire while Nayeli prepared the last of the food. The silence between them had become something else now, not cold but protective. They didn't need words. As the flames flickered low, the sheriff took out the wooden toy horse he had found near the wrecked stagecoach days earlier. He turned it over in his hands, lost in thought. Nayeli noticed, her eyes widening. It was the same design, carved in the same Apache style, the same as her son's toys. The sheriff didn't see her reaction, but something shifted in her heart. A fragile belief that fate was pulling their paths together for a reason neither yet understood. Outside, the wind howled again. The night was far from peaceful, because somewhere beyond the plains, the men who had sent those bounty riders were coming. They wanted the sheriff, and the Apache widow who had stolen his horse. The desert was quiet, but not for long. The night wind swept through the abandoned mining shacks, whistling low through the cracks in the wooden walls. The fire burned small and weak, its glow barely touching the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to breathe. The sheriff and the Apache widow rested apart but not distant, each lost in thoughts that weighed heavier than the desert night. Sheriff Colton Hayes had spent years chasing outlaws, but now, for the first time, he felt as if he were the one being hunted. The faces of the men he had killed at the mission haunted him, but not because of guilt alone. It was the silence afterward, the kind of silence that only came before another storm. He knew that those men hadn't come on their own. Someone had sent them, someone with money, reach, and reasons. He sat still, polishing his revolver, listening to the faint crackle of the fire. Every now and then, he would glance toward the sleeping widow. Her breathing was steady now, no longer ragged from exhaustion. Her shawl, worn and frayed, covered her like a fragile promise against the cold. He wondered how many nights she had slept under the open sky, praying for mercy that never came. And yet, when she woke, there was always that quiet strength in her eyes, the look of someone who had already seen the worst the world could offer, and still chose to keep walking. The sheriff didn't know yet why he hadn't turned her in. Maybe it was the memory of his own wife, who had died years ago during the fever that swept through Redwood Bluff. Maybe it was something in the widow's face that reminded him of forgiveness, something he hadn't known in a long time. By dawn, they were on the move again. The sun rose slowly over the plains, burning away the mist that clung to the low hills. Dust trailed behind them like a faded memory. The air carried a strange stillness, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. The sheriff's instincts were sharp. He could read the land the way a preacher reads scripture. Every ridge, every trail, every shift of the wind told him something. And what it told him now was clear. They weren't alone. Far behind, the faint marks of hooves cut through the sand. At least 4 riders, moving steady, patient, hunting. He didn't tell Nayeli. She was already carrying enough ghosts. Instead, he led her off the main trail, weaving through canyons and dry creek beds, choosing paths where the wind would scatter their tracks. As they traveled deeper into the wilderness, the land began to change again. The red stone turned to pale dust, and patches of cactus rose like silent sentinels. They passed the skeleton of a long-dead saguaro, its arms reaching toward the sky like a prayer that had gone unanswered. By midday, the heat was merciless. The sheriff shared the last of his water with Nayeli and his horse, though he said nothing of how little was left. His skin burned under the sun, but he didn't slow. He knew that once they reached the southern ridge, there would be a stream, a thin line of life winding through the desolation. When they finally reached it, Nayeli knelt beside the water and washed her face. Her reflection wavered in the current, older than her years but still touched by grace. For a long time she stayed there, staring at her hands, hands that had once held a child, now scarred and empty. The sheriff stood watch nearby. In his silence, he carried questions he'd never ask. Who had she been before all this? What dreams had she buried along the road? And was it fate or guilt that had crossed their paths? As the afternoon light began to fade, they followed the stream to where it wound around a cluster of cottonwoods. There, hidden among the trees, lay the remains of another camp, burned but not forgotten. charred wood, scattered bones, the smell of old smoke. Nayeli stopped, her breath catching, the patterns carved into one of the fallen poles, the same tribal marks from her people. This had been an Apache camp once, her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. She searched the ground desperately, turning over ashes and stones as though she might find a trace of the life that had been stolen. Among the ruins, the sheriff found a single object half buried in the dirt, a small wooden rattle decorated with feathers, a child's toy. He brushed the dust away and handed it to her. For a moment she couldn't move. The sight of it tore open a wound that had never healed. Her hands trembled as she held it close to her chest. Somewhere deep inside her, a faint spark of hope stirred again. Maybe her son had been here. Maybe he had escaped. Maybe he was still alive. The sheriff watched her quietly. He had seen hope destroy as many people as it saved, but he said nothing. He understood that some hopes weren't meant to be reasoned with. They were meant to be carried, no matter how heavy. They made camp near the edge of the cottonwoods. The wind carried whispers through the leaves, soft and mournful. The sheriff's horse shifted restlessly, ears twitching toward the north. He felt it too, that uneasy stillness before trouble. As night fell, the sky turned black and vast. The stars shone hard and cold above them. Nayeli sat near the fire, clutching the wooden rattle, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the horizon. The sheriff sat opposite her, his revolver laid across his knees. He didn't need to look to know what was coming. The riders were close now. He could sense it the way animals sensed a predator. Every instinct in him screamed that the next dawn would bring blood. The fire burned lower, the desert quieting as if holding its breath. The widow began to hum a soft tune, a song from her tribe, old and sorrowful, meant to guide spirits across the great river. For the first time in years, the sheriff felt the ache of something he thought he'd buried, the memory of his wife singing that same kind of tune on quiet nights long ago, before the fever took her and their child. He turned his gaze toward the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. Somewhere out there, beyond the silence, the hoofbeats of death were coming closer. And yet beside him sat a woman who had nothing left but faith. When the fire died out completely, the sheriff finally stood, his shadow tall and grim against the dying light. He checked his weapon and stared toward the north. The time for running was nearly over. Somewhere out there, under the same cold stars, the men who had followed their trail for days were preparing their own fire, a signal of what would come when dawn broke. And as the first light of morning began to stretch over the desert, the sheriff knew that the past, his and hers, was about to catch up with them both. The dawn came red and heavy, as if the sky itself had bled into the earth. A strange stillness hung over the cottonwood grove, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through dry leaves. The fire from the night before had burned down to pale embers, and the smoke curled weakly into the air, a signal for anyone watching from afar. Sheriff Colton Hayes was already awake, standing near the ridge that overlooked the open plains. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, his eyes narrowed against the sun. The tracks behind them were clear now, too clear. The men following them had closed the distance during the night. He could feel it in the air, that quiet anticipation before chaos. Behind him, Nayeli stirred. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The wooden rattle still hung from her hand, a symbol of a past she refused to release. Her face carried the calm of someone who had already accepted whatever fate had decided, yet her eyes still searched the horizon, for hope, or perhaps for something beyond it. The sheriff turned back toward her, his gaze heavy. He had led her across deserts, canyons, and blood-soaked ground, but now the trail was ending, not because they had reached safety, but because there was nowhere left to run. The plains stretched wide and merciless before them, shimmering under the heat. In the far distance, a thin cloud of dust rose. Riders. He counted 4, maybe 5, the same men who had hunted them since the mission. The sheriff began preparing their camp in silence. He saddled his horse, checked the ammunition, and buried what little food remained. Every movement was deliberate, methodical, calm, the ritual of a man who had lived too long with death at his shoulder. Nayeli watched him, realizing that something in him had changed overnight. There was a stillness about him now, the kind that came before surrender, not to fear, but to duty. They left the grove and rode south toward the canyon rim, where the land fell away into a labyrinth of cliffs and shadowed gorges. The sheriff knew the terrain. He had hunted outlaws through it years ago. It was the kind of land where a single mistake could send a rider plunging to his death. As they descended into the canyon, the air cooled. The sound of hooves echoed off the stone walls, chasing itself into silence. The sheriff stopped beside a narrow pass where the trail split in two. He studied the tracks in the dust, fresh prints heading their way. The bounty riders were closing in. He dismounted and led his horse behind a cluster of rocks, motioning for Nayeli to stay low. She obeyed, clutching the rattle close to her chest. Time stretched long and thin as they waited in the shadows. Then, faintly, the echo of hoofbeats grew louder. The first rider appeared at the rim above them, a tall figure wrapped in a dark coat, a rifle slung across his back. Another followed, then two more. Their movements were cautious but confident, the way men walked when they believed they were the hunters. The sheriff's eyes hardened. He knew their kind. Mercenaries, killers for hire, men who didn't care about the badge or the cause, only the price on a life. He waited until they had dismounted, their horses tied loosely near the edge. Then, like the desert itself had woken, the silence shattered. The first shot rang out sharp and fast. Stones splintered near the sheriff's shoulder as he returned fire. The canyon erupted in noise, the echo of bullets bouncing off the cliffs, the screams of startled horses, the roar of thunder that wasn't from the sky. Nayeli stayed low behind the rocks, trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs. The world had turned into smoke and fire. Dust filled her lungs, choking the air. Through the haze she could see the sheriff moving, not like a man but like a ghost. Every step, every shot was measured, deliberate. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for something deeper, maybe for redemption. The first two riders fell quickly, their bodies tumbling into the dust. The third tried to flank from the ridge above, but a single bullet from the sheriff's revolver dropped him where he stood. When the last shot faded, the canyon returned to silence. Only the wind remained, carrying the smell of gunpowder and iron. The sheriff lowered his weapon, breathing slow and heavy. His coat was torn, his face streaked with dust and blood. One of the bullets had grazed his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. Nayeli crawled from her hiding place, her eyes wide with fear and something more. Awe. She looked at the fallen men, their bodies twisted in the dust, and then at the sheriff standing among them, a figure carved out of the desert itself. But before either could speak, a sound broke the quiet. A faint whimper, not of pain but of life. It came from behind one of the dead riders. The sheriff approached cautiously and found a small figure hidden beneath a blanket in one of the horse's saddlebags. A child, thin, trembling, his face streaked with dirt. Nayeli's breath caught in her throat. The boy's dark eyes looked up, terrified. His skin bore the same copper hue as hers, his hair long and tangled, his clothes torn, and around his neck hung a familiar token, a small carved amulet shaped like a hawk. It was the same one Nayeli's husband had carved years ago for their son before the soldiers came. Her hands shook as she fell to her knees. The truth struck her harder than any storm. This boy, this frightened, quiet soul hiding from death, was her child, the one she had thought lost to war and ashes. The sheriff stepped back, understanding dawning in his eyes. Fate had done something neither of them could have planned. It had brought mother and son together through blood, fire, and mercy. Nayeli gathered the boy into her arms, her body trembling with relief and grief all at once. The sound that escaped her lips was not a cry but something older, a prayer of gratitude whispered in a tongue the wind carried away. The sheriff stood apart, watching in silence. There was something almost sacred about the moment. For a man who had spent his life chasing law and order, this, the reunion of a mother and her lost child, felt like the first righteous thing he had seen in years. But he also knew it wasn't over. The men they had killed were only a handful. Someone else had sent them, someone who would not stop until both he and the widow were dead. The canyon walls loomed high and red around them, sealing them in like the inside of a grave. The sheriff holstered his revolver and looked toward the southern trail. The only way out. The sun was sinking low now, bleeding into the horizon. Shadows stretched long, reaching across the ground like dark fingers. He knew the final reckoning was near. And as Nayeli held her son close, whispering words of comfort through her tears, the sheriff turned his face toward the coming night, a night that would decide not only their fates, but the measure of mercy itself. The desert, silent and vast, waited. The morning after the gunfight was cold and silent. A gray mist hung over the canyon like a shroud, clinging to the stones and the scattered bodies left behind. The air smelled of dust, blood, and spent gunpowder, the familiar perfume of death in the Wild West. Sheriff Colton Hayes stood alone at the edge of the gorge, staring down at the still forms of the men he had slain. His revolver hung heavy at his hip, his eyes distant and unreadable. The echoes of violence had faded, but the weight of it remained. Behind him, Nayeli sat by the embers of a dying fire, her son pressed close to her chest. The boy had barely spoken since the night before. Exhaustion had claimed him, and sleep had come only after tears. Now he slept quietly, his small hand wrapped around the hawk-shaped amulet. For the first time in years, Nayeli allowed herself to breathe, the ache that had hollowed her heart since her husband's death, the endless hunger and fear that had driven her to steal a stranger's horse. All of it had led to this, to finding her son again, to being alive when every force in the desert had conspired against her. But as the mist began to lift, a chill settled deeper inside her. She knew, as did the sheriff, that the world they stood in would not forgive them. Those men they killed were not the last. There were always more. Riders, bounty hunters, soldiers, men with badges and men without. The West never forgot a debt, and blood always drew flies. The sheriff turned from the gorge and approached her. His limp was worse that morning. The wound on his shoulder had stiffened overnight, and the bruising had spread across his ribs, but he said nothing of pain. He had carried worse burdens before. He looked at Nayeli and the boy, a mother and child reunited by fate's cruel hand, and something softened in his chest. For the first time since he put on the badge, he began to question what the law was truly worth, if it had no room for mercy. The canyon was no longer safe. He knew the only way out was through the open plains toward Fort Mason, a 2-day ride if the weather held, but traveling there meant risking discovery. The boy, half Apache, would be taken or killed by the soldiers. And Nayeli, she would never survive imprisonment again. He thought of the bounty on her head, the same notice he had once nailed himself to the town's bulletin board. A wanted widow accused of theft, resistance, and violence she never committed. The sheriff realized then that the law he'd been serving had become blind. It no longer saw the truth. It only saw orders written by men who lived far from the dust and blood of this land. He made his choice quietly. By noon they were moving again, south, away from the fort, toward the mountains where the land rose in jagged folds and the horizon blurred into the clouds. The sheriff led them through dry riverbeds and rocky paths, following trails only he seemed to know. The sun climbed high and harsh, turning the land into a furnace. The horses staggered with exhaustion. The boy, weak from hunger, clung to Nayeli's waist as she rode behind the sheriff. When they finally reached the high pass by evening, the world seemed to stretch endlessly below them. From that height, the desert looked almost peaceful, golden waves of sand rolling beneath a burning sky. They stopped near an abandoned way station, a lonely cabin that had long ago surrendered to the wind. Its roof sagged, its windows broken, but it still offered shelter. There, the sheriff made camp for what he knew would be their last night together. The fire burned small and steady. The sheriff sat apart from them, his hat low, his revolver resting beside him. He seemed lost in thought, not of victory but of reckoning. He thought about the day he first saw Nayeli, desperate and starving, trying to take his horse outside the town. Back then, he had been ready to drag her before the judge, to let the law handle her fate. But now, after all they had endured, he understood something he hadn't before. Sometimes the law wasn't justice. Sometimes it was just another kind of cruelty. He looked up at the stars, remembering the countless souls buried under that same sky. Outlaws, innocents, widows, children, all claimed by a land that belonged to no one. He wondered if God watched this country anymore, or if even he had turned away from the dust and the blood. Nayeli approached quietly, the boy asleep beside the fire. She placed a small bundle near him, the rattle, the amulet, and a single eagle feather, symbols of her people, of loss and survival. The sheriff didn't speak, but he nodded, understanding the meaning. This was her farewell. When dawn came, he saddled his horse one last time. The wound in his shoulder had worsened, blood stained the sleeve of his coat, yet his movements were steady. He handed Nayeli the reins of his horse, the same horse she had once tried to steal. Its dark eyes glimmered in the morning light, strong and loyal. Nayeli looked at him, her face pale with confusion. But the sheriff only gave a faint, tired smile, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had already made peace with his fate. He told her, not with words, but with the weight of his gaze, to take the horse, the child, and ride east until she reached the border. There she could find the Apache settlements that still held out against the encroaching world. There, maybe, she could begin again. She understood. The tears came silently, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She mounted the horse, the boy held close in front of her. The sheriff watched them go, their figures growing smaller as the desert swallowed them. He stayed until the sound of hooves faded into the wind. Then slowly he turned back toward the west. He could already see the rising dust cloud in the distance. Riders, more bounty men, perhaps soldiers. He holstered his revolver, checked the chamber, and stood tall against the growing storm. His badge glinted once in the sunlight before he tore it from his coat and let it fall to the ground. The metal hit the dust with a soft, final sound, like the last note of a prayer. He faced the horizon and waited. The first shots came before noon, echoing through the valley. The wind carried the sound far and wide, the tale of a man who chose mercy over law, who stood alone so a widow and her child could live. When the echoes finally died, the desert was quiet again. Days later, travelers would find the sheriff's body near the edge of the canyon, his revolver empty beside him. They would bury him there, overlooking the land he had once sworn to protect. And though no one marked the grave, word would spread in whispers about the sheriff who spared an Apache widow and gave his life for her freedom. Far to the east, under the shade of a mesquite tree, Nayeli would stop her horse and look back once more toward the setting sun. She would hold her son close, whispering words of love and promise into his hair. She would remember the man who showed her kindness when the world offered none. And in time, when the boy grew old enough to ask who saved them, she would tell him not about the law, or the badge, or the bullets, but about mercy. Because sometimes, in the cruel land of the Wild West, mercy was the bravest thing a man could carry. The wind would rise again, sweeping across the plains, carrying their story into legend, a tale of redemption, sacrifice, and the sheriff who chose not to kill.